Hi friends. Tonight, we begin a quiet journey through the alleyways and winding hearts of Victorian Birmingham, England, a place of soot-covered bricks, clattering hooves, and whispers from the fog. This story is not about the television drama, though it shares the same name. Instead, we'll uncover what it was really like to be a Peaky Blinder, part of a rough brotherhood that lived in the shadows of industry and empire. Our tale begins not with violence, but with silence, as the smoke of chimneys curled into the sky, and a young boy named Thomas Mallory walked into his fate. The gas lamps flickered with a restless hiss, their light bleeding like old honey across the wet cobbles of Garrison Lane. It was the winter of 1887, and Birmingham was a beast of smoke and sweat. Iron bones grinding in the factories. Ash settled on rooftops like snow that would never melt. The night had teeth, and yet young Thomas Mallory moved through it like a ghost. He was 12 years old that year, thin as a matchstick but clever. His father, a bricklayer, had died in an accident at the canal docks. His mother had taken to coughing blood into her apron and whispering prayers to a crucifix that hung crooked over their hearth. Times were poor, as they were for many, but in Birmingham, poverty didn't beg, it fought. Thomas had heard of the Blinders long before he saw one. The older boys at school spoke of them in reverent tones, street lads with razor blades sewn into the peaks of their caps, who walked with a lean of casual defiance. They were not men of noble birth, nor scoundrels without purpose. They were a new breed, shaped by the soot-stained hands of the city itself. They were myth and menace. That night, Thomas was on an errand. He carried a sack of coal stolen from a back alley yard, meant to keep his mother warm for one more night. He didn't know it yet, but he was being watched. The figure appeared at the edge of his vision, half cloaked in smoke and fog, leaning against the bricks like ivy. A man, or maybe a boy, wearing a long coat and a flat cap that hid his eyes in shadow. "You run like you're afraid of the dark," came the voice, low and slow, as though the speaker had all the time in the world. Thomas froze, clutching the sack to his chest. "I don't want trouble," he said. His voice barely carried past the whistle of the wind. "Good," the figure replied, stepping forward. "Because trouble finds you just the same." His name was Harry Fleet, and he was 17. He wore the silent grin of someone who knew more than he ever said aloud. The copper badge on his lapel was not of the police, but of his gang. One of the early Blinders. He didn't threaten Thomas. Not that night. Instead, he offered him a hand and a story, a whispered tale of brothers who'd carved out their place in a city that gave nothing freely. The Peaky Blinders, he said, were not just criminals. They were survivors, wardens of a code unwritten. Harry offered Thomas a single copper coin, not for the coal, but for his silence. "Tell no one you saw me," he said, "and next time, I might give you more than coin." Thomas nodded, and so it began. Over the next weeks, Thomas found himself wandering near the same alley, always, in the evenings, always with ears open for the soft click of Harry Fleet's boots, and slowly, stories began to unfurl like parchment scorched at the edges, stories of how the Peaky Blinders were born, not as lords of crime, but as lost boys hardened by war, hunger, and the cold machinery of the industrial world. They were the sons of coalmen, glassblowers, factory workers. Their jackets were stitched with pride, not fashion. Their hats, with peaks not merely to blind, but to mark them as sharp-eyed kings of the streets. "People think it's the razors that made us feared," Harry once told Thomas, lighting a cigarette with his head bowed. "But fear doesn't come from steel. It comes from what men believe you'll do with it." "There were rules," Harry explained. "No harm to children, no betrayal among kin, and when coin was taken, it was shared." To Thomas, these tales were like dream-soaked bedtime yarns, only they came in whispers through smoke and rain. He found himself longing for the next tale more than food some days. His mother still coughed, in the evenings, but when she asked where he went, he only smiled. As winter stretched on, the city's breath became a thin mist that that hung in alleyways and clung to chimney stacks. One evening, Thomas returned home to find the fire already lit, a small pile of coal beside it, and a note tucked beneath a cup of tea. Every brother needs warmth. H. It was then that Thomas realized he was being recruited, not with threats, but with warmth, with story, with a strange kind of loyalty. He did not yet wear a peaked cap. He had no blade nor voice in the meetings held in the back rooms of smoke-filled pubs. But he had something better, a name remembered by someone like Harry Fleet. The first lesson of being a real Peaky Blinder, Thomas would learn, was not how to fight, but how to see, how to watch, how to read a man's heart like ink on parchment. And so, as the gas lamps flickered above and the clock tower tolled midnight, Thomas Mallory, the boy with stolen coal in his arms, took his first step into the fold, not with violence, but with silence, and a promise unspoken. The frost hung thick that December, curling along window panes like delicate veins of silver. Birmingham's chimneys exhaled endless trails of smoke, as though the whole city were sighing through cracked lips. In the early hours of dawn, when most children still dreamed beneath patched quilts, Thomas Mallory was already awake, eyes fixed on the soft shadows dancing across his wall. He hadn't yet worn the cap, not the kind with the blade tucked inside. But in his heart, something had shifted. A strange pride had begun to bloom, a feeling not born of cruelty, but of being chosen. Harry Fleet had not returned for several days. In that absence, Thomas's thoughts grew thick with questions. He wondered where the blinders gathered when they weren't haunting alleys or slipping notes beneath teacups. He wondered how a boy was transformed into something more, a figure of both respect and fear. His mother noticed the change in him. She did not speak of it aloud, but mothers rarely need words to read their sons. One evening, while her cough calmed just enough to pour tea, she set down the chipped cup and looked at him with tired, knowing eyes. "You're walking different," she murmured, her voice like wind over ash. Quieter, taller, like you know something. Thomas only shrugged. "I suppose I do." She said nothing else. But her gaze lingered, and in that look, he felt both love and worry stirring like tea, leaves at the bottom of a forgotten cup. The next encounter with Harry came not in an alley, but in a railway yard blanketed by night. The air smelled of oil and damp metal. Train cars sat like sleeping beasts, their wheels clicking softly as they cooled. Harry stepped out from behind a stack of crates, wearing a long coat that flared at the hem and a fresh scar across the side of his neck, thin and pink, like a ribbon tied too tight. "Come with me," he said. No greeting, no smile, just command wrapped in calm. Thomas obeyed. They wove between the train cars, boots quiet on gravel. Harry moved like smoke, his steps barely marking the earth. At last, they reached a boxcar where a small group had gathered, 5 or 6 figures, mostly older than Thomas but younger than true men. Each wore a cap. Each had eyes that gleamed not with cruelty, but with a strange, careful wisdom, like chess players who studied faces more than moves. "This is him," Harry said, "the lad with the sharp ears." A boy with auburn hair and a missing front tooth stepped forward. "He the one who ran coal for his ma?" "He is," said Harry. The auburn-haired boy nodded once, then held out something wrapped in cloth. It was a cap. Flat, dark wool, heavy in the hand. A faint click sounded when Thomas touched it. He looked up, confused. "There's a razor in the brim," Harry said, quiet. "Not for fighting, unless you must. It's to remind you. There's always danger in looking too close." Thomas turned the cap over in his hands. The blade was tucked so neatly that it was almost invisible. A whisper of steel. "I'm not sure I'm ready," he said, voice barely more than a breath. Harry knelt beside him. "None of us were ready, Thomas, but the city doesn't ask if you're ready. It just pushes. And you either push back or get buried." That night, Thomas learned the first true law of the Blinders. It wasn't about the blade. It wasn't about theft or territory. It was about silence. Loyalty, said the auburn-haired boy, whose name was Reggie, isn't in words, it's in what you never say. Each boy in that boxcar swore an oath, not with blood or dramatics, just a shared drink from the same tin flask. A sip passed hand to hand, a gaze locked with each other, and then poured out. Onto the ground, for the ones we've lost, Reggie whispered, and the ones who keep us warm. The ritual was quiet, almost sacred. Thomas drank last. The liquid burned, but it steadied him. You don't steal from kin, said another voice. You don't harm women. You don't take what isn't earned. And if someone breaks the code, Thomas asked. Harry met his gaze. Then they're not blinders anymore, and they find out how cold the world can be without brothers. The cap fit snug on his head. He didn't wear it home that night. Instead, he wrapped it in an old cloth and tucked it under his bed. His mother asked no questions, but when she passed his room that evening, she paused. A long pause. You're not a thief, are you? She asked softly. No, he said. I'm just learning. She didn't reply, but a tear rolled down her cheek as she walked away. Not from sorrow, perhaps, but from the strange ache of knowing her son was slipping from the boy he'd once been, towards something else. The next weeks were filled with lessons. How to walk unnoticed, how to listen without appearing to, how to watch the door of a shop and know its habits, when the safe was opened, when the grocer went to lunch, who the baker trusted with keys. But it was not lawless. Every job required approval. Every coin was accounted for. Thomas never saw the razors used, but he saw what they meant. One afternoon, a rival gang, called the Gallows Men, tried to muscle into blinder territory near the Red Hill Market. They came with sticks and shouts. The blinders responded with silence. Not a single blade was drawn, but by nightfall, the Gallows Men had disappeared. No one knew how. No one asked. That, Harry told Thomas later, was power, not in the noise, but in the quiet. And so, Thomas Mallory became a blinder. Not yet a legend, not yet feared, but known, trusted. He learned the rhythms of the city, the flicker of gaslight on cobbles, the whistle of the tram, the way voices, carried in fog. The cap stayed hidden at home. But on the streets, he walked differently now. Eyes forward, shoulders back. Not because he was dangerous, but because he belonged. And in a city where few belonged to anything but hardship, that made him powerful indeed. Morning in Birmingham was rarely soft. Even at dawn, the air carried the weight of smoke and iron, rising from the coal-hungry furnaces that stitched the city's heart together. Horses clopped through slush-streaked streets, the grocers barked, through fog, and newsboys rattled headlines no one could afford to read. But beneath all of that, beneath the soot and struggle, there existed another economy, one not printed in ledgers or counted by clerks. Thomas Mallory had begun to learn the weight of coin, not by how it was spent, but by how it was earned in silence. Harry Fleet took him to the markets that week. Not the grand shops on Corporation Street, but the winding lanes near the canal, where stalls sprang up like mushrooms, and deals were made with glances rather than words. The market at Red Hill was the blinder's ground, and it was here that Thomas saw how wealth moved like water, quietly, constantly, reshaping the stones beneath it. Look close, Harry said, as they leaned beside a draper's booth, hands tucked in pockets, eyes casually scanning. What do you see? Thomas squinted. People buying cloth. Harry smiled faintly. What else? He waited. Then Thomas noticed. Every third stall was manned by someone who nodded to Harry. The money passed from hand to hand always included a moment where fingers lingered just slightly longer than necessary. And more curiously, many of the sellers weren't selling at all. Their goods sat untouched, yet the ledgers behind the stalls were thick with writing. Are they pretending to sell? Thomas asked. No, Harry said. They're moving money. laundering it. Some call it turning dirty coin into clean business. He explained gently, never rushing the boy's understanding. A shop that paid taxes could hide some coin. A stall could take bribes for another's favour. A cobbler could patch a boot with a secret message stitched inside. Everything had value, if you knew how to weigh it properly. Information, Harry said, is worth more than gold. But only if you know who's listening. Later that day, they visited a tobacconist who operated as a message man for the Blinders. The sign above his shop read, R. Delaney's Fine Imports. But behind the shelves of cigars and snuff were hidden compartments containing notes, coins, sometimes even keys to lockboxes placed around the city. Delaney knows every copper that walks this quarter, Harry whispered. He writes their schedules down in code. We know where they'll be before they do. Thomas found himself staring at the ledger on the counter. It was filled with numbers that didn't match any prices. He writes fiction, Harry said, with a grin. Every page tells a story, if you know how to read it. The days that followed were full of quiet walks and quieter lessons. Thomas began to understand that the Peaky Blinders weren't just a gang. They were a system, a shadow economy built not on chaos, but on careful strategy. They owned nothing, and yet they influenced everything. The grocer who paid them weekly in coin was protected from petty thieves. The pie maker who slipped a meat roll into Harry's pocket did so not from fear, but from gratitude. Her son had been saved from a beating by a rival crew weeks before. It was not extortion, it was ecosystem, and Thomas, still only 12, was fast becoming a student of this unspoken commerce. He watched how Harry would nod to a chimney sweep and receive a gesture in return. Fingers tapped twice on the heart, blinder sign language for all clear. He learned how to mark a wall with a piece of chalk that washed away in the rain, but meant everything to those who saw it. A single X meant trouble. A circle meant watch. 2 lines crossing meant not ours. It was a city of signs, and Thomas was beginning to read it fluently. One evening, Harry gave him a task. You're to collect ledger slips from 3 shops, he said, handing Thomas a folded piece of paper. Don't speak unless they do. Don't read them. Just carry. Can you do that? Thomas nodded. The streets were slick with melting frost, and the air had that strange taste of coal and damp leaves. He walked quietly, hands tucked in his coat, eyes sharp. The first shop, a watchmaker, handed him the slip without a word. The second, a pub on Bell Street, passed it in the guise of a receipt. The third stop was a tailor's on Garrison Lane. The tailor looked at him for a long while before handing over the folded paper. You're young, he said. Too young for this game. Thomas said nothing, but as he walked away, he noticed something strange. The slip was damp, too damp. A smell lingered, something metallic. He hurried back. Harry read the slips in silence, brow furrowing at the third one. He tore it open. Inside was not an account or address, but a warning. They know we're watching the Northern Rail Yard, Harry muttered. Thomas sat quietly. Was it a trap? Could be, Harry said, then met his eyes. But now we know they know, and that makes it our move. That night, Harry praised him. You're quiet, lad. Most your age would shout to be seen. Thomas smiled faintly. I think I like watching. Harry nodded. Good, because what makes a blinder feared isn't the blade. It's that we see everything and say nothing. Thomas placed the cap on his head that night, only for a moment. In the mirror, he saw not just himself, but something older, wiser. The cap wasn't heavy, but it carried weight nonetheless. In the weeks to come, Thomas learned to balance both worlds, the one of factories and steam, and the other of whispers and chalk marks. The blinders taught him not how to steal, but how to manage, how to keep order where the law did not. It was a strange morality, perhaps, but it was one that made sense in Birmingham, where justice often came too late, or not at all. And so, beneath gas lamps and ledger slips, under the eye of his mother and the watch of his brothers, Thomas Mallory grew into something new. Not yet a leader, but no longer just a boy. The factory whistle howled each morning like a wounded beast, its cry echoing down the soot-caked lanes and alleys of Birmingham. For many, it was a summons to work, to sweat, to survive. But for Thomas Mallory, it became something different. A reminder, a rhythm. That shrill call had once meant hunger. Now it marked the passing of days in a life steadily transforming, slowly, quietly, into one bound by loyalty, secrets, and the shadowed dignity of brotherhood. He was still only a boy, yes, but he was no longer merely a boy. Not after what the Blinders had shown him, not after what he had seen. That winter, the gang moved cautiously. Word had spread of gallows men regrouping further east, drawing strength from dockside smugglers and former soldiers cast adrift. Their name alone made shopkeepers flinch and mothers clutch their children. But the Blinders weren't afraid. They were watchful. It was in this season of tension that Harry Fleet began a new kind of lesson. "Come with me," he said one morning, the frost biting their breath as they walked along the canal. "You've seen how coin moves. Now you'll see what keeps men from tearing each other apart." They arrived at the smelting yard near Duddeston, where steel roared like thunder and fire danced behind thick walls of soot-covered brick. It was a place where men became muscle and where coal fed not only engines, but empires. "Every blinder," Harry said, "has worked the yards. It's our forge, not just for steel, but for spirit." The foreman was a thick-armed man named Tullis, his face half hidden behind a beard of iron grey. He did not smile when Harry introduced Thomas. He merely nodded once, then pointed. "You'll be tending the slag," he said. "Shovel, dump, repeat. Don't burn your bloody hands." And that was it. No special treatment, no stories, just work. Thomas laboured for 6 days straight in that yard. The heat blistered his skin, and the weight of the slag shovel bent his spine. The steam stung his eyes, and his fingers bled from splinters and rough iron edges. But he did not complain, not once. The other workers barely noticed him at first, but slowly they began to nod his way. Then speak, then offer him water and advice. "Watch that corner," one said. "The steam valve's loose. Keep your weight in your heels," another muttered, "or you'll slip and lose more than your footing." It was gruff kindness, passed like smuggled warmth. At night, Thomas returned home, aching and silent. His mother left bread and broth on the table, but asked no questions. She saw his burns, the black under his nails, and she only brushed the hair from his eyes. "You're becoming your father," she whispered. He didn't reply, but in his heart, he felt something heavier than pride. He felt belonging. On the 7th day, Harry returned. "You've earned your place now," he said. Thomas frowned. "In the gang?" "No," Harry replied softly. "In the brotherhood." He led him away from the smelting yard and into the back streets behind a row of old stables. There, in a narrow yard hidden from view, stood a group of men and boys. Some familiar, others not. They wore no uniforms, no sigils, just the caps, always the caps. A fire burned in an iron drum, and above it a chain hung with old tools. Blades dulled with age, boot scrapers, metal files, each a relic of labour. Harry stepped forward and placed a piece of coal into the fire. "This," he said, "is not ceremony, it's memory." Each blinder present stepped forward in turn, adding something small, a fragment of cloth, a broken button, a scrap of newsprint. When it was Thomas's turn, he hesitated. "I don't have anything," he whispered. Harry leaned, close. "Then give us your word. That's heavier than all the rest." Thomas nodded. He stepped forward, heart pounding, and said, "I won't speak of what I've seen. I won't leave when it's hard. I won't take what isn't mine." Silence followed. Then a voice spoke from the back. "Sounds like a blinder to me." A few low chuckles followed. not mocking, approving. Reggie, the auburn-haired boy with the missing tooth, stepped forward and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You've walked through fire," he said. "Now you're one of us." From that day forward, Thomas was trusted with more. He helped carry ledgers between safe houses, learned which rooftops gave the best view of patrols, and even assisted in crafting the chalk symbols that marked Blender territory. But what meant more than tasks was the growing sense of family. These weren't just boys with blades, they were survivors. Some had no homes, some had lost siblings to famine or fever. Many had no mothers left to tuck them in, or fathers to teach them trade. But within the Blinders, they found warmth. One rainy evening, Thomas sat with Harry on a rooftop, watching the lights of the city flicker like distant stars. "Why do they call us blinders?" he asked at last. Harry smiled faintly. "Some say it's the razors. Others say it's because we move so fast we blind the law before they see us coming. But I think..." He paused. "It's because we blind fate. We don't wait to be chosen, we choose each other." That night, as Thomas lay in bed, his muscles sore and his hands raw, he found himself smiling. Not because life was easier now, but because it was shared, because in the cold heart of a city that took more than it gave, he had found fire. And that fire, though small, burned with the strength of brothers. The city never slept entirely. Even in the deepest hours, when the bells had ceased and the last tram had groaned to a halt, Birmingham breathed through whispers. From distant dogs howling along canal banks to the creak of shuttered doors pulled, quietly closed, there was always motion, always life beneath the surface. Thomas Mallory had learned the rhythm of this life, not just in the smoke and steel of the streets, but in the stillness of home. And that stillness was never so present, so deeply felt, as when he looked upon his mother in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. Her cough had deepened that spring, becoming more than a sound, becoming a punctuation to every silence. She rarely spoke of her pain. It was not the way of women in Birmingham's working quarters. They endured quietly, as though strength itself was stitched into their aprons and knotted into their shawls. One night, Thomas found her sitting by the hearth, staring at a letter she never posted. It was written in neat cursive, folded and unfolded until the creases ran like roads across its surface. "Who's it for?" he asked gently. She looked up, startled. "No one. Just habit." He sat beside her, saying nothing. After a long moment, she whispered, "It was to your father, when he still worked the docks. I wrote every week, not to send, just to keep him with me." She handed it to him. The letter was simple. Just notes of the weather, the cost of bread, a neighbour's illness. It was unremarkable in its contents, and yet it hit Thomas with a strange weight, because between the lines lived love, quiet, enduring love, the kind not shouted or sung, but folded into pages and tucked into pockets. Over the following days, he began to notice the women more. Not just his mother, but the wives, sisters, and daughters who waited at doorways and leaned from windows. They rarely appeared in the blinder meetings or schemes, yet they were everywhere, silent witnesses to a world they could not command but deeply understood. Harry spoke of them once as the two sat on the edge of a bridge, boots dangling over the canal. "You know what holds the Blinders together?" he asked. "It ain't the blades, ain't the brass, it's the mothers." Thomas frowned. "How do you mean?" Harry tossed a pebble into the water, watching the ripples stretch. "Every lad in the gang has someone he doesn't want to disappoint, someone he fights for. Sometimes it's a brother, sometimes a girl, but most times, it's her." He nodded toward a distant figure, a woman hanging out laundry in the fading light. "She don't know where her son is half the time," Harry said. "But she leaves the window cracked, just in case he comes home hungry." One evening, Reggie told a story that stayed with Thomas for years. They were sitting in the yard behind an old chapel, the stones around them cold with rain. "My ma used to keep a drawer of things," Reggie said. "Buttons, hairpins, broken, bits of necklace. She said every piece told a story." Thomas looked at him. "What kind of stories?" "The kind you don't say out loud," Reggie murmured. "Like the cufflink my dad dropped the day he never came back. Or the locket she wore the day she buried her own mother." He paused. "I found her once, holding that locket and humming a tune I didn't know. Just rocking in her chair like time had stopped." Thomas said nothing, but in his chest, a quiet ache stirred. That night, he checked his mother's drawer for the first time. Inside were not treasures, but fragments, a spool of thread, a photograph faded at the edges, a key to a door long lost, and, tucked into the corner, were several folded pages that smelled faintly of lavender. They were addressed to him, unsent, unspoken. One began, "Thomas, my little lantern in the dark." He didn't read further. He didn't need to. He knew in. The weeks that followed, Thomas began leaving small things on the mantel when he returned home late. A wrapped bun from a shop near Red Hill, a single flower stolen from a garden, once even a ribbon of blue silk. His mother never said thank you, but each item disappeared by morning, and on one quiet night, when her cough had stilled and her breathing was deep and even, Thomas found something at the foot of his bed, a hand-stitched handkerchief with the letter T embroidered in one corner. He carried it always after that, tucked near his chest beneath his shirt. Not for luck, but for grounding, a thread back to the woman who waited. Harry once said that the worst thing about gang wars wasn't the blood. "It's the letters," he said. "What letters?" Thomas asked. "The ones you have to deliver," Harry replied, eyes hollow. "To the women who waited." He had once carried a letter to a mother who thought her son was working at a factory down south. Instead, he'd been buried in a grave behind a pub, his cap the only marker. "She asked me if he suffered," Harry said. "And I lied. I said it was quick. Truth is, I don't even know if it was him. Could have been someone else's boy." Thomas looked at the street below them, quiet and black with shadow. "Will that happen to us?" he asked. Harry didn't answer. He only reached into his coat and handed Thomas a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" "Your first letter," Harry said. "Write it now. Don't wait." And so, Thomas began his own letter that night. Not one he meant to send, but one he would keep, tucked in the lining of his coat. A voice for a future that might never come. The streets of Birmingham had no shortage of bullets, but it was words, quiet, hidden and unsent, that carried the true weight. And in a world built on silence, it was the women who remembered. The mothers who waited, the sisters who watched, and the boys who, despite all odds, still came home. There is a stillness that settles just before violence, a kind of hush that wraps around the world like a blanket drawn too tight, where even the wind seems to pause, holding its breath. Thomas Mallory learned to feel that hush before he ever saw blood spilled. He felt it one night in early summer, when the fog curled low and the street lamps flickered like nervous eyes. The Peaky Blinders did not fight often, but when they did, it was never for sport. They were not drunkards throwing fists outside a pub. Their battles were deliberate, strategic, quiet. A blinder's weapon was not rage, but restraint sharpened into a point. That week, tensions had grown between the blinders and the gallows, men. It started with whispers, then threats. Then a shopkeeper near Red Hill found his windows shattered and his till emptied, not by common thieves, but by those bearing a crude painted noose on the wall behind them. Harry Fleet did not respond. With fury, he responded with silence. He gathered the boys in an abandoned tannery near the river, its stone walls heavy with the memory of labour and old blood. "They want a reaction," he said, standing beneath the beams that creaked in the wind. "But we won't play their tune. Thomas stood near the back, his cap held tight in his hands. Reggie spat onto the ground. "They're baiting us," Harry nodded. "And we'll bite, but not their way." That night, Thomas was assigned to watch a corner near Garrison Lane. His task was simple: observe, take note of movement, look for signs, a match lit in the dark, a whistle out of place, a chalk mark on a doorway. The city spoke in signals, and the blinders listened like monks to a sacred text. The moon was veiled by clouds, and the rain came soft as whispers, soaking his collar and dampening the cobblestones. Thomas pressed into the shadow of a doorway, hands tucked under his arms for warmth. Hours passed. Then, from across the street, he saw them, two figures moving too smoothly for drunks, too fast for regular folk. They were boys, older than him, clad in dark coats with caps low over their faces. One paused to mark a wall with something red. The other stood watch. Thomas didn't move. He didn't need to. Another shadow emerged behind the boys, silent, lean, sure-footed. It was Reggie. The first boy turned just in time to see the glint of steel, not raised, but resting. Reggie said nothing, but the presence of the blade, even sheathed, was enough. The two gallows men retreated, muttering curses that carried no real threat. Reggie nodded once to Thomas as he passed. "Well done," the gesture seemed to say. "Well watched." The fight didn't come with a bang. It came with breath. 2 nights later, near the canal junction at Bordesley, the gallows men made their move. They believed the blinders had grown soft, too fond of their rules, too tied to the Bar code. So they attacked a boy named Eli, barely 15, cornering him behind a warehouse and beating him until his leg broke. It was a line crossed, and now there would be no more waiting. Harry's orders were precise. No knives, no caps, no names. The retaliation would be fast, clean, unforgettable. Thomas wasn't asked to fight. He was asked to watch. But watching could mean danger too. He stood on the rooftop of a disused bakery, crouched beneath the slope of the chimney. Below, the gallows men drank in a back alley pub, laughing over stolen coin and a bloodied cap taken from Eli. Then came the moment. 3 blinders stepped from the shadows. Reggie, a boy called Rook, and someone Thomas didn't recognize. A tall, quiet figure with a limp. They said nothing. The gallows men barely had time to react. No weapons were drawn at first, just fists, calculated, swift, surgical. The fight was not loud. It was a dance of motion, knees to ribs, elbows to jaws, shoulders, turned at just the right moment to avoid a blow. One gallows boy raised a bottle, and it shattered harmlessly on the brick as Reggie twisted away. And then came the blade, not used in anger, but in declaration. The tall blinder removed his cap, and in a single motion, sliced the air beside one rival's cheek, close enough to draw a line of blood, shallow and clean. "Leave," he whispered. The boy ran. So did the others. No one was killed, no one crippled, but the message was clear. The blinders were not to be tested. When Thomas climbed down from the rooftop, heart racing, he found Harry waiting. "You saw?" Harry asked. Thomas nodded. "You afraid?" Thomas thought for a moment. "No," he said. "Not afraid. Just awake." Harry placed a hand on his shoulder. That's the right kind of fear. In the days that followed, the streets fell quiet again. The gallows men retreated from Red Hill. No more shops were vandalized. No more messages painted in red. Even the coppers, who had been circling like carrion birds, seemed to vanish into the mist. But something had shifted in Thomas. He had seen what it meant to walk the razor's edge, to wield power without surrendering to it. He had watched violence executed with grace, with control, with silence. It was not something to glorify. It was something to understand. That evening, Thomas sat at home, his mother asleep in her chair. He took out his journal, the one where he wrote things he would never say aloud and penned a single line. A fight without sound can be louder than 1,000 screams, and he meant it. The train yards of Birmingham held a rhythm all their own. In the early hours, when the city's breath was still slow and heavy with sleep, the great beasts of iron and steam began to stir, shunting forward with groans and bellows, dragging, behind them, the burden of coal, freight, and unseen secrets. For the Peaky Blinders, those yards were more than machinery and soot. They were arteries, silent veins through which messages, money, and men could move undetected. And in that labyrinth of steel, Thomas Mallory found a new purpose. He had proven himself watchful, loyal, brave in ways that did not require fists. Now came something more precise. Running the rails, Harry told him one morning, isn't about speed, it's about trust. They stood near the edge of the New Street junction, where tracks braided like black vines across the gravel. Smoke curled into the sky in lazy spirals, and a guard's whistle shrieked in the distance. Each train that leaves here, Harry said, carries more than cargo. It carries news, messages tucked in crates, letters hidden in ledgers. Even the ink on an invoice can mean something if you know how to read it. Thomas nodded, absorbing every word. You'll start small, Harry continued. Nothing dangerous, just drops. That first task was simple, a parcel the size of a teacup wrapped in brown cloth, to be handed off to a porter named Alfred at the Aston stop. Don't talk to anyone, Harry warned. And if anyone asks, you're running an errand for your uncle. Thomas wore a cap, with no blade that day. He walked with the posture of an ordinary boy, clutching the parcel like a loaf of bread. But beneath that ordinary shell, he carried the weight of purpose. He boarded the local train as it hissed and jerked forward, its carriages smelling of oil and old timber. The men aboard barely noticed him. Coal workers heading to shift, a fishmonger dozing beside a bucket. When the train reached Aston, he stepped off quietly. Alfred, a man with a limp and a kind smile, was waiting at the far end of the platform. Thomas handed over the parcel without a word. Alfred nodded once, tucked it beneath his coat, and disappeared into the mist. Mission complete. But the thrill, that remained. In time, the parcels became notes, then ledgers, then envelopes sealed with wax and marked only with cryptic symbols. A fishhook, a black star, a pair of crossed boots. Thomas never opened them. He didn't have to. The messages weren't his to read, only his to move. He learned to map the rail lines in his mind, the way the northeastern split from the great western, which stations were quiet, which guards could be trusted, which carriages had blind spots, and more importantly, how to vanish. You're not a shadow yet, Reggie told him once, passing him a folded timetable, but you're learning to bend the light. The Blinders relied on these messengers more than they admitted. The coppers were clever, the rival gangs, watchful, but no one looked twice at a boy with coal on his boots and a satchel across his chest. They were invisible by design, and invisibility was power. One afternoon, Thomas delivered a note to a man in Wolverhampton. It was short, just 2 lines, and written in a hand he didn't recognize. But the man who received it nodded solemnly, then tossed it into the canal without reading it again. Sometimes, Harry explained later, the message isn't in the words, it's in the act of giving. There were dangers, of course. Once, on the platform at Moore Street, Thomas noticed a constable watching him too closely. The man's eyes lingered on the parcel in his hands, then flicked toward the station doors. Thomas didn't run. He merely shifted his course, passing the parcel to a flower vendor with a practiced hand. The vendor, part of the network, tucked it under a bucket of violets without pause. Thomas bought a single daisy, smiled politely, and walked away. The constable followed him for 2 blocks before giving up. Back at the safe house, Harry laughed. "You're turning into a right little fox," he said. "Good instincts." Thomas grinned, but deep down, he knew it wasn't instinct. It was training, the result of watching, listening, and trusting those quiet lessons the blinders taught without ever raising their voices. Not all the rail work was glamour. Sometimes it meant carrying bundles of forged documents. Sometimes it meant slipping coins into hidden compartments beneath carriage benches. Once, Thomas even had to retrieve a note sewn into the hem of a sleeping drunkard's coat. But through it all, he learned patience, precision, the value of silence. He also saw the wider web, the alliances between blinders and other crews in cities like Manchester, Coventry, even London. Messages passed not just for mischief or theft, but for politics, trade deals, favours called in, and debts paid across miles. The blinders weren't thugs, they were diplomats, kings without crowns, moving pieces across a board that most people didn't even know existed. And Thomas was becoming a trusted player. One rainy evening, as he disembarked at a small rural station, he found a letter waiting for him, left on a bench, his name scrawled on the back. Inside, a single line. Your father worked these same rails, walked the same gravel. Blood runs in loops, boy, don't forget. There was no signature, but the meaning was clear, and Thomas felt it. Not fear, but affirmation. He wasn't just running messages, he was continuing something begun long before he could walk that night. As he rode the last train home, rain streaking the windows and the city lights glowing through mist, Thomas rested his head against the cold glass. He was tired, but not weary. He was small, but not powerless, because the rails beneath him did more than carry steel. They carried stories, and he had become one of them. There are places in every city that hold secrets without ever being asked to. Places that seem ordinary to the hurried eye, but to those who move slowly, those who listen, they hum with memory, with meaning. In Birmingham, one such place was the King's Chance. Nestled on a crooked corner between a smithy and a tannery, the King's Chance was a pub of little reputation to the outside world. Its windows were always fogged, its paint always peeling, and its sign, a rusted crown, swayed, slightly even when there was no breeze. But to the Peaky Blinders, it was something else entirely. It was home. Thomas Mallory first stepped through its door on a grey evening when the rain was falling not in sheets, but in threads, as though the sky itself was stitching something across the rooftops. Harry Fleet held the door open for him, nodding once. You keep your ears open and your mouth shut, Harry said gently. Thomas nodded, his cap in hand. The inside of the King's Chance was dim, lit by amber gaslight and warmed by a fire that never seemed to go out. The air was thick with tobacco and the low scent of roasted barley. Around mismatched tables sat men and boys alike, each one with a cap, a scar, a silence. But they weren't drinking heavily. They weren't singing or shouting. They were watching, playing chess, reading newspapers, speaking in a language Thomas didn't yet fully understand. One of glances, gestures, breath. At the back of the pub, a narrow staircase led to an upper room. It was there that the real business happened. But Thomas wouldn't see that room for many weeks. First, he had to earn the floor. Each blender who entered the King's Chance followed a ritual. They tapped the rim of their cap before sitting. They placed their coin on the table upside down, and they never asked questions unless offered an answer first. Reggie explained this with a grin, nursing a pint of dark ale. See? The pub ain't a place for plans, he said. It's a place for presence. Thomas furrowed his brow. What's the difference? It means you don't come here to act, Reggie said. You come here to be. If a man's lying, this place'll press it out of him like juice from fruit. For the first few visits, Thomas sat quietly beside Harry or Reggie, listening. He learned to read the pub like a book. How the man with the limp always sat facing the door. How the woman behind the bar, everyone just called her auntie, never wrote anything down but never forgot an order. He noticed that the mirrors behind the bar were placed not for vanity, but for vision. You could see the whole room in the curve of their glass. And the back wall, it held no windows, just a map of the city, marked with tiny brass pins. Sometimes a pin would move, sometimes one would be removed. No one ever said why. One evening, Auntie brought Thomas a bowl of stew and a cup of strong tea. No charge, she said. Just eat it like someone who's earned it. He did. It was the best thing he'd tasted all year. After the meal, Harry slid a folded piece of paper toward him. "Draw the room," he said. Thomas blinked. "Now?" Harry nodded. So Thomas, with pencil and stubby notebook, sketched every table, every figure, every cup. He labelled the mirrors, the pins, even the stains on the floor. When he finished, Harry looked it over, then smiled. "Welcome to the ground floor." From that night on, Thomas became part of the fabric. He wasn't just a boy at the table. He was a thread in the weave. He learned who sat where and why. He learned that when a certain man scratched his beard twice, it meant he was reporting news. That when Auntie lit a second candle behind the bar, it meant a message was ready in the cellar. And he learned the most important rule of all: never speak a plan aloud in the chance, because the walls heard, and not all ears were friendly. One night, Harry took him upstairs. The room was small, wood-panelled, and dim. At its centre was a round table marked with old knife cuts and spilled wax. Around it sat 5 men and women, all in their 20s or 30s, all watching Thomas with unreadable expressions. "This," Harry said, "is the circle." Thomas didn't speak. One of the men, a dark-skinned fellow named Mason, asked, "What did you see downstairs tonight?" Thomas listed every detail: who entered, who left, what was ordered, where the pins were placed. When he finished, the woman with silver rings on every finger nodded once. "He's got the eyes," she said. From that moment, Thomas was cleared for messages upstairs. He wouldn't attend the meetings yet, but he would run notes, deliver codes, and, on rare occasion, sit at the table when a vote was needed from the younger ranks. One night, as they walked home, Harry said softly, "You know why we call it the chance?" Thomas shook his head. "Because every time we walk in, it might be the last." He paused. "But we do it anyway, because it's ours." Thomas looked back at the flickering sign, the rusted crown barely visible through the fog, and he understood. The quiet pub had become something more than a building. It was a sanctuary of silence, of ritual, of power forged in whispers. And in that silence, Thomas had found his voice, not one made of sound, but of presence. The streets of Birmingham had their own language, one older than ink and far quieter than speech. It echoed in footsteps, lived in shadows, and passed from hand to hand like a coin warmed by generations. It was not a language taught in books or spoken aloud in schoolrooms. It was lived, learned, and inherited. They called it the Code. By the time Thomas Mallory turned 13, he could read the city the way other boys read penny novels. A crossed pipe on a doorstep meant the house was safe. A child skipping rope outside a grocer's shop could be a lookout, tapping her foot twice to warn of constables nearby. A window left slightly ajar on Garrison Lane meant a package was ready behind the coal scuttle. Each gesture, each movement, was part of a silent conversation that wrapped around the city like thread through cloth. But the code was more than marks and signals. It was principle. Harry explained it best one morning as they walked past the tram depot, smoke curling around their boots like curious cats. "Laws are written by people with clean hands," he said. "But codes are written by those who survive with dirty ones." Thomas nodded slowly. "So it's our law?" Harry gave a sideways grin. "Not quite. It's our line. You cross it, you're out. Doesn't matter how tough you are." That week, Thomas witnessed his first reckoning. A boy named Ivor had broken the code. He'd stolen from a family under the Blinders' protection, a widow who sold ribbons and mended gloves for the dockside workers. Ivor had slipped into her room and taken the last of her rent from beneath her bed. The boy thought it clever. Quick. Easy coin. He was wrong. The blinders didn't beat him. They didn't shout. They gathered. In the king's chance, silent as statues, Ivor stood in the middle, cap in his hands, eyes downcast. Harry read the charge, not from a paper, but from memory. Betrayal of trust, theft from the circle, harm to the defenseless. Each sentence was followed by silence. Then Reggie spoke. "What do we do, Tom?" It took Thomas a moment to realise he was being addressed. He looked at Ivor, who was no older than 15, pale, shaking. He remembered the rules, the ones that mattered. "No more blinder," Thomas said softly. The room nodded, and just like that, Ivor was gone. Not physically, not violently. He simply no longer existed to them. And in a world that lived by whispers, to be unseen was the harshest sentence of all. Later, Thomas asked Harry why they hadn't punished him more harshly. "Because," Harry replied, "we're not brutes, we're builders." He paused. Punishment teaches fear. Silence teaches memory. The next weeks were filled with study. Thomas learned how to draft the markings used in code, not just for warnings, but for paths. A line with 3 dots beside it meant follow the child. A downward triangle meant trouble inside. A symbol shaped like a bird's foot signified gather tonight. He etched these signs into chalkboards in the back of the king's chants, practiced until his fingers cramped. He also learned the pause, a technique used when delivering a message. You knock once. Wait. Knock twice. Wait longer. The pattern told the receiver if the message was safe, if danger followed, or if the meeting should be delayed. It was all part of the dance, and once you learned the steps, the city opened like a puzzle box. One evening, Thomas was sent with a message to a cooperage on the outskirts of Digbeth. It was late, and the fog lay low across the ground. As he walked past the warehouse walls, he spotted a familiar mark, 2 crossed chalk lines at knee height. He stopped. Trouble. He ducked into a side alley and made his way around, slipping through a butcher's yard and circling toward the back. From there, he could see the cooperage door. It was ajar. Inside, a man leaned over a ledger. Another man, unfamiliar, stood at the entrance, watching the street. A trap. Thomas folded the message into the sole of his boot and walked on, whistling. A folk tune. He didn't deliver that night. Instead, he returned 2 hours later, after the unfamiliar man had gone, and dropped the message into the barrel left beside the soot stack, a secondary drop point. By morning, the message had been received. Harry, when he heard, clapped Thomas on the back. "You're starting to think like a street." But the code also demanded sacrifice. Sometimes it meant letting a friend fall to preserve the network. Sometimes it meant leaving a question unanswered because the answer risked lives. Once, Thomas was asked if he knew where a missing boy had gone. He did. The boy had fled north, chased by debts and fear. But speaking it aloud could draw enemies. So Thomas lied, and the guilt followed him like shadow for weeks. But then, a letter came, delivered in the folds of a glove, signed only with the initials of that missing boy. Still breathing. Tell no one. Thank you. One rainy afternoon, Auntie gave Thomas a folded square of cloth. Inside was a patch embroidered with the blinder symbol, 4 small slashes surrounding a central dot. "You're trusted," she said, voice low. "So wear this where only brothers can see." He stitched it into the lining of his coat, over his heart, and from that day forward, whenever he saw that mark, on a wall, on a fence post, carved into the edge of a bench, he knew he was not alone. The city spoke, and he was fluent in its voice. Not every moment in a blinder's life was spent watching doorways or moving secret messages through fog. There were slivers of time between the errands and the warnings, the meetings and the danger, pockets of quiet where boys remembered they were human, not just parts of a hidden machine. These were the stolen hours, the smoke signals of life lived in shadows. For Thomas Mallory, these hours often began with the lighting of a cigarette, not for need, but for ritual. He didn't smoke, heavily. Most of the younger blinders didn't, but they carried cigarettes like symbols, rolling them slow and neat, lighting them only when the work was done and the fog was still. Harry once called it ghost fire, that orange glow flickering in alley corners or beneath train trestles, marking where brothers gathered not to plan, but to rest. One such gathering happened late in summer, near the abandoned courtyard behind a disused tram station. The rain had stopped, and the cobblestones still glistened beneath the moonlight. A low fire crackled in an iron drum, its warmth rising with the smoke. Reggie, Thomas, and two others, Finn and Louis, sat on crates and stones, passing a bottle of cheap cider between them. No business tonight, Reggie declared. No chalk talk, no coin counts. Just breath. Thomas leaned back, arms resting on his knees. The cider burned, but the warmth of the fire made the ache behind his eyes fade. He watched the smoke rise and wondered how many moments like this they had left. How many were granted to boys who lived by silence and blade? Louis was telling a story about how he once stole a policeman's sandwich without being seen. Had it right off the bench beside him, he grinned. He was talking to some butcher, didn't even look round. Best bit of ham I've had in my life. The others laughed, not too loud, but real. Finn shook his head. You'll get caught one day. Not unless I want to, Louis replied, tapping the ash from his cigarette with a wink. These moments, these laughs, these bottles passed hand to hand were not meaningless. They were essential, a kind of glue for the cracks that inevitably formed in a life lived beneath gas lamps and threat. Thomas found he looked forward to them more than the thrill of the messages or the rush of narrowly dodged eyes. There was something sacred in watching, the firelight dance on Reggie's scar, or in the way Finn always whistled the same tune after 2 sips. Once, Thomas brought a harmonica. He didn't know many songs, just fragments his father used to play. But that night, by the fire, he played the soft notes of Annie Laurie, and for a moment, the city beyond the alley disappeared. Reggie hummed along. Louis closed his eyes. Even the fire seemed to quiet its crackle. The city, of course, never stayed silent for long. By day, Thomas ran errands, eyes sharp. By night, he marked his chalk codes on walls. But always there were spaces, small, silent intervals, where life insisted on being lived. He'd slip into a bakery on his way back from the rail yards. The baker, a woman with flour-streaked cheeks, would hand him a half-loaf with no words, just a glance and a nod. Sometimes he'd walk past the school he'd left behind, pausing only long enough to watch the children through the gate. Their laughter struck him oddly, familiar and foreign all at once. He wasn't jealous, just aware. There were lives that ran parallel to his, lives with books and desks and parents waiting at the door with dry towels. But he did not wish to switch paths. His life, though shadowed, had meaning. One rare Sunday, Harry took him to the outskirts of the city. No mission, no coded talk, just the hills beyond the canal, where the smoke thinned and green crept slowly into view. I used to come here with my brothers, Harry said, tossing stones down the slope. Before the caps, before the streets. They sat in the grass, watching clouds crawl across the sky. Thomas had never seen the city from that angle before. It looked smaller, almost peaceful. "Do you ever want to leave it all?" he asked. Harry was quiet a long time. "I used to," he said, "but now, it's in my blood." He turned to Thomas. "You'll feel it too one day. The pull, like the streets are whispering your name." Thomas believed him, because even then, as they sat beneath open sky, he could feel Birmingham calling, him home, not with words, but with smoke, brick, and pulse. That night, Reggie shared a piece of poetry he'd scribbled on a tram ticket. It wasn't proper poetry, just words that had come to him while watching a pigeon land beside a dead lantern. We light what we can in a city that eats the dark, and we wait for dawn that never quite arrives. Thomas folded the scrap and kept it. He didn't tell Reggie, but he would read those lines again and again on nights when sleep would not come. Smoke rose slowly from a rooftop chimney. Somewhere in the city, a whistle blew. And in the narrow space between the two, between work and war, blade and bread, Thomas lived, not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as a boy growing slowly into the kind of man who understood the value of silence and the power of stolen time. There was a time in every Blinders journey when the oaths went deeper than whispered promises or shared glances in the fog. When loyalty was not only proven in small deeds and silent gestures, but bound, figuratively and almost ritually, by what they called the knotted hand. It was neither a contract nor a ceremony. There were no priests, no candles, only 5 fingers, a twisted cloth, and the weight of trust. Thomas Mallory had watched it once, long ago, when he was still too new to the gang to be seen, let alone invited. He'd watched from a cracked door in the basement of the King's Chance, peering into a room where Reggie, Louis, and 2 older boys clasped hands around a strip of red wool, knotted 3 times, soaked once in gin, and then burned in a dish. Between them, it was not spectacle, it was pact. Now, nearly a year since his first coal run, Thomas found himself before that same door, this time not to watch, but to enter. Harry stood beside him, quiet as ever. "Your name's been whispered, in good places," he said. "Time to bind it," Thomas swallowed. "What do I do?" "Show up. Be honest. Don't lie to the fire." The door creaked open. Inside sat 5 Blinders. Reggie, Finn, Mason, a girl named Nell who handled code between Coventry and Birmingham, and finally, Auntie, the unspoken matriarch of their chapter. They sat around a table bearing nothing but a dish of ash and a strip of knotted blue cloth. Harry gestured to the empty chair. Thomas sat. Nell spoke first. "What would you do if you caught a brother stealing from a sister?" "Stop him," Thomas answered. "And if that brother was someone you grew up with?" Thomas hesitated. "Still, stop him." Mason leaned forward. "Would you lie to protect someone you love?" Thomas met his gaze. "Only if the truth would kill them," they nodded, quietly, purposefully. Reggie pushed the cloth toward him. "This knot," he said, "binds what we don't speak, not to trap you, but to remind." Thomas took it. It felt heavier than it looked. He held it over the ash dish, then reached forward to light it with a taper from the table. As it burned, filling the room with the scent of wool and something older, Auntie murmured a line Thomas had only heard in passing. "May what we know never harm what we love." And it was done. Afterward, they left in pairs, as was tradition. Harry and Thomas walked toward the canal, boots scuffing stone in rhythm. "You're one of us now," Harry said. "I thought I already was." "You were," Harry replied. "But now you're also responsible." Thomas looked down at his hands. They were steady, but his heart was not. In the days that followed, the bonds between the gang seemed tighter, more deliberate. They spoke less, but shared more. Reggie handed Thomas his last cigarette before a long watch, unasked. Nell passed him notes to deliver, trusting him without question. Even Finn, known for his temper, stepped aside one night to let Thomas take lead on a message run to Sparkbrook. There was peace in this rhythm, but peace, in their world, never lasted long. It began with a whisper, a tip from an old railway cleaner, that someone had passed a fake symbol, an altered chalk mark used only between trusted runners. It had been seen near the Balsall safe house, where documents were kept and ciphers decoded. No one wanted to believe it, but Harry, careful as always, ordered an inspection. The results were chilling. 2 coded messages, one regarding trade routes, another a list of names, were missing. Only a few had known they were even stored there, and among them was Louis. The revelation cracked the gang like ice beneath sudden weight. Louis had been there since before Thomas joined. He was part of the fire circle, a teller of jokes, a thief of ham sandwiches. But now his face was marked with questions. At first, there were no accusations, only silence. But that silence echoed louder than any shout. Thomas watched Louis shrink. He stopped laughing, stopped coming to the pub. Then, one evening, Reggie called a meeting behind the copper yard. Louis came. So did the others. Thomas lingered, at the edge, hidden behind crates of scrap. Reggie's voice was not angry. It was broken. You looked me in the eye and told me we were brothers. Louis didn't deny. He just said, I was scared. Of who? Nell asked sharply. Louis looked at the ground. The men from London. They knew things they shouldn't. Harry stepped forward. And so, you gave them more? I didn't tell them everything. But you told them something, Auntie said, arriving without warning, her shawl glistening. With dew. Louis's hands trembled. Thomas stepped into view. You could have told us, he said. We'd have helped. Louis looked up at him with eyes already full of goodbye. I didn't want to lose you. You already have, Reggie whispered. That night, the Blinders did not exile Louis. They did something worse. They unmarked him. His coat, once stitched with the secret symbol, was stripped. His name was removed from the chalk logs. His messages were reassigned, and his face, once greeted with nods, was now met with empty stares. He had not been cast out. He had simply been erased. Thomas didn't sleep for 2 days. He kept seeing Louis's face, remembering his stories, his fireside laughter. Betrayal did not erase memories. It only burned them deeper. And yet, the code was clear. To protect the many, one must sometimes be lost. It was the cost of trust, the price of the knotted hand. The streets of Birmingham were often spoken of as belonging to men. The bootsteps, the blades, the silent glances exchanged beneath street lamps. But for those who looked more closely, another rhythm pulsed beneath the surface. One softer, yes, but no less powerful. The Blinders, with their razored caps and coded whispers, did not survive on muscle alone. They survived because of the women who held their world together, sometimes gently, sometimes fiercely. Thomas Mallory began to understand this not from books, but from life. It started with Nell. She was a quiet figure at first, appearing in the background of meetings, slipping notes to Auntie, translating French or Latin scribbles on intercepted papers. Her fingers were stained with ink more often than blood, and her coat carried the scent of lavender soap and pipe smoke. But beneath her soft-spoken manner was a mind sharp enough to split stone. She remembers everything, Reggie once told Thomas. Every face, every mark, every lie you thought you buried. Thomas believed it. He'd watched her correct a cipher mid-sentence, then recite a list of pub safehouses backwards, in order of location and security level. She don't raise her voice, Reggie said. Doesn't need to. One night, Nell pulled Thomas aside after a message run. You rush the signal, she said calmly, not unkind. 3 knocks, not 2. The wrong rhythm can mean the difference between meeting a friend or walking into a raid. Thomas nodded, embarrassed. She handed him a folded paper. Train with this. It was a code book, handwritten, illuminated with small flourishes in the margins. You wrote this? No, she said, pausing. I rewrote it. The original had gaps. Then there was Auntie. No one seemed to know her real name. She was just Auntie, to the boys, to the runners, even to the elder Blinders. She ran the King's Chance with a gentle hand and an iron spine. She never raised a fist, but once, when a constable spoke cruelly to a servant girl near the pub, Auntie stepped outside, lifted her apron, and revealed a revolver wrapped in a dishcloth. Would you like to discuss manners? She asked. The constable left without a word. To Thomas, she was warmth without softness. When his mother was too ill to speak, it It was Auntie who brought broth. When Thomas forgot his scarf, it was Auntie who knotted a spare one around his neck, saying only, "Cold kills quicker than bullets." But Auntie was more than caretaker. She kept the records, every oath, every debt, every promise made beneath her roof. And when decisions were made, truly made, it was not the loudest voice that held sway. It was hers. The girls of the Blinders were never as visible as the boys, but they were there. They were lookouts disguised as flower sellers, runners posing as washerwomen, saboteurs who could slip powder into the axle of a police wagon without so much as lifting their skirts. They learned the same codes, they bore the same cuts, and they watched everything. One evening, Thomas met a girl named Elsie. She sold buttons near the train yard, had a cart and a crooked tooth, smiled like she knew things she didn't have to say. She pressed a button into his hand once, blue with a chip in the center. "Top step of the freight tower," she said, "behind the second beam." That night, Thomas found a folded paper hidden in a loose board, details of a gallows men gathering near the canal. He returned to thank her. Elsie wasn't there, only a note pinned to the cart. Not all who vanish are lost. It wasn't just their intelligence or bravery that made these women essential. It was their balance. While the boys bore the weight of knives and loyalty, the women carried memory, reflection, warning. When Louis betrayed them, it was Nell who spoke first. "I saw it in his hand," she said. "The way he held his pen. He was copying, not recording. No anger, just quiet truth." In the safe houses, the women kept the logs. In the hideouts, they patched wounds and drafted new maps. In the dark, they lit candles and read, not fairy tales, maps, rotas, dot cipher, sheets. They were not hidden behind the blinders. They were within. Thomas began to seek their advice more and more. He asked Nell how to read facial tells. "How do I know if someone's lying?" he asked. She touched her temple. "You already know, but your trust is too loud." He asked Auntie how she remembered so much. "Because I listen more than I speak," she replied. "And I write down what hurts." He never forgot that line. Versailles, Blinders would later be remembered in song and story as men with blades in their caps and steel in their eyes. But the truth? Their strength came from balance, from feather and flame. The women weren't behind them, they were beside them, and in time, when Thomas's story was retold, when boys whispered of his messages and his oaths, it was the names of Nell, Auntie, and Quiet Elsie that he would speak first. Because he knew, you can't build an empire on muscle alone. You need memory, and mercy, and minds sharper than steel. Loss does not arrive with the same footsteps as fear. Fear knocks, loud, cold, quick. But loss slips in through the back door, settles into your coat collar, and waits. And when it finally announces itself, it's already made a home inside, your chest. Thomas Mallory had known fear. He had walked through fog with his heart in his throat, had hidden from boots and bayonets, had swallowed his breath beneath tramcars and railway bridges, but he had not known true loss, not yet. It came to him one grey morning, the sky the colour of cold tin, the streets still slick from last night's rain. It came with a button. He had been assigned a small run, nothing unusual, just a note to deliver, from the King's Chance to a cobbler near the canal, and then on to a warehouse by the edge of Ladywood. Routine. Unremarkable. Reggie was supposed to meet him at the second point, leaning by the back fence, same as always, hands in his pockets, smirk just under the surface. That was how it always went. But this time, Reggie wasn't there. Just the warehouse, just the wind, and a single brass button resting on the ledge beside the water barrel. Thomas knew it instantly. It belonged to Reggie's coat, the one with the ink stain on the sleeve and the tear near the hem. The brass buttons were a gift from his cousin in Manchester, something he'd once bragged about over cider. Thomas picked it up slowly, still warm, still smelling faintly of pipe smoke and city. Dust. He waited, 10 minutes, then 20. Then finally, he left the message in its drop point and ran, not walked, back to the pub. Inside the King's Chance, something was already wrong. The chairs weren't in their usual places. Auntie was nowhere to be seen. Nell stood near the bar, hands clenched. Harry spoke in hushed tones to two men by the door. No one raised their head as Thomas entered. He stepped forward, lifted the brass button. "Where's Reggie?" he asked. Harry looked up and didn't speak. Nell took the button from his hand gently. "It's confirmed," she asked. Harry nodded. Thomas sat down without meaning to. His knees simply gave. They didn't find a body. Not that day. Not ever. But the signs were there. The gallows men had been seen in the area, a cart left burned by the old tram line. A single drop of blood on a wooden fence post. And that button, placed, not dropped. A message. Thomas didn't cry. Not that night, not the next. It took 3 days before he allowed himself the silence long enough to grieve. He sat in the back room of the King's Chance, the maps all rolled up, the fire burning low. In his hand, the button. He rolled it between thumb and finger, over and over, until the skin went raw. Auntie entered quietly. "You don't need to speak," she said. He didn't, but he asked anyway. Why him? She thought for a long time. "Because he smiled too much," she said. "Because he was kind. And sometimes, kindness is louder than a knife." Reggie had been more than a brother to the Blinders. He had been their warmth, their laughter. He told the worst jokes, stole the best pies, and always had a story about someone else's mistake, never his own. He once smuggled a message inside a hollow lemon, just because he said no one would suspect a citrus fruit. He was foolish and brave, and gone. The Blinders held no funeral. There was no body, no priest. Instead, they lit a candle at each of the 3 Blinders safe houses, one at the baker's, one at the tram depot, and one behind the sewing shop where Reggie once danced, with a girl named Evie under the hanging laundry. Each flame stood for a part of him. The laughter, the loyalty, the loss. Thomas lit the final one himself, hands trembling as the match flared. He left the brass button beneath it, tucked into the wax. The streets changed after that. Or maybe Thomas changed. He walked with heavier steps. He spoke less. He began checking twice before crossing alleys, watching the rooftops for shadows that didn't belong. The joy of the work dulled. The thrill of the message runs faded. In their place, focus and fire, Harry noticed. "You're colder now," he said. Thomas didn't deny it. "I thought we couldn't lose," he said. Harry stared out at the fog. "That's what makes us lose." A week later, Thomas received a note in a cracked envelope. Inside, a torn piece of a newspaper. An article about a fire. No names, no charges. Just a corner of cloth with soot on it. Nell confirmed it had come from one of the Coventry Blinders. "It was him," she said. "That's the mark." Thomas didn't ask more, because sometimes closure doesn't arrive in full sentences. Sometimes it arrives as ash. He didn't forget. Even years later, Thomas would find himself reaching for that button. Though it was long gone, melted into wax and memory. He would remember Reggie's whistle in the dark, the way he always tapped the table twice before speaking, the way he said "lad" like it meant something more than age. Reggie had been the first to call him a brother, and now he was the first to leave. Loss had entered through the back door. It had taken a seat at the table, and though they would laugh, again, fight again, drink again, they would never again be whole. In a world built on whispers and glances, the arrival of the electric telegraph might have seemed like the death of silence. Words, once precious and carried by hand across streets and through the shadows, could now travel with sparks across wires buried in walls and strung between towers. But for the Peaky Blinders, this technology was not a threat. It was an opportunity. Thomas Mallory first heard the crackle of a telegraph wire while waiting in the corner of a tailor's back room. The line hummed faintly behind the wall, threaded with tension. A clerk sent a short code, 5 dots, 2 dashes, a pause, and then silence. "What was that?" Thomas asked. The tailor smiled. "News, lad. Travelling faster than footsteps." At first, Thomas dismissed it. The Blinders were a street-bound brotherhood, not a network of wires and keys. But then came the war between the Dockers' Union and the railway hands, a week of strikes, blockades, and saboteurs. And in that chaos, the Blinders lost their northern courier. 2 entire safehouses had no contact for days. It was Nell who said, quite simply, "We need to listen, not just speak." A week later, Harry brought Thomas to a shop on Little Charles Street. The sign above the door read, "Wool and Wire." Officially, it sold knitting patterns, reels of yarn, and bobbins. But inside, beyond the soft clack of needles and the rows of wool, lay something far stranger. In the back, behind a green curtain, sat a boy no older than 16, tapping furiously at a small brass telegraph key. His fingers moved like spiders over the board, sending bursts of electric language across a series of crude wires that glowed when touched by signal. "This is Wren," Harry said. "He listens." Wren didn't look up. 3 messages from London today, 1 from Bristol, 1 unknown. Thomas stepped closer. "How?" Wren pointed to a loop of wire on the wall. "Old railway scrap, buried beneath the canal. We piggyback off the line." He paused. "They think they're sending messages in peace, but the lines carry echoes." From that moment on, Thomas was assigned to assist Wren. Not with the machinery, he wasn't fast enough, but with the memory. Each code had to be logged, sorted, traced. He spent hours beside the boy in the back room, listening to the strange language of dashes and dots. Nell visited often, translating long streams of signal into legible orders. Auntie sent tea and never asked questions. It was Thomas who began organising the records, not in ledgers, but in stitched books with colour-coded thread, 1 for trade routes, 1 for law enforcement chatter, 1 for gang movements. Each entry, marked not with a title, but with a single sewn symbol, a star, a cross, a dagger, sometimes a teardrop. And then came the night of the hidden telegraph. It began like any other. Rain, wind, the rattle of shutters. Wren tapped at his key, face pale in the lamp glow. Thomas sorted slips, binding each one into a folio for Nell. But then Wren, he stopped. He leaned close to the receiver, eyes narrowing. "Something's wrong," he whispered. Thomas moved to his side. The signal was erratic, dots and dashes out of rhythm, but not broken, just strange. "It's not London," Wren said. "Not Bristol. It's coming from within Birmingham." "From where?" "Somewhere near the rail junction." They decoded the message together. At first it made no sense. Then Thomas spotted the pattern. It was a blinder code, an old one. One only the founding circle would know. A warning. A safe house had been compromised. They moved fast. Nell was summoned. Harry was roused from the street. Finn joined with 3 other runners, and by midnight they reached the safe house near Digbeth. It was empty, not just of people, of everything. Maps, ledgers, even the furniture. Gone. No blood, no fire, just absence. Thomas turned to Harry. "How did they know?" Harry shook his head. "They didn't," Nell said, stepping forward. "We told them, by accident." She held up the decoded message. This was a test, a mirror signal. They were listening too. Wren looked stunned. "They reversed our piggyback, or built their own." That night, the Blinders did something they hadn't done in years. They went dark. No chalk, no runners, no signals. For 48 hours, silence ruled. During that time, Thomas helped Wren dismantle the shop's telegraph relay. Wire by wire, they unwound the secret network, buried pieces beneath floorboards, burned notes, scattered ashes. It was like burying a friend. Wren looked devastated. "I thought we were ahead," he said. "You were," Thomas replied. "But now we're smarter." In the weeks that followed, a new system emerged, no longer centralized, no longer tied to one signal point. Each message now passed through 3 hands. Each relay required a physical token to activate, and the final step, paper burned on site. Wren developed an encryption so complex it required 4 keys and 2 memory holders to decode. Nell rewrote the cipher book from scratch. And Thomas? He stitched every new code book with wool thread from wool and wire, marked, not with letters, but with a single brass pin, one for Reggie. Because even in wires, they remembered the people. Sometimes, Thomas still dreamt of the signals, tapping in the dark, bursts of meaning sent into the void. But now, he knew. The streets, maybe shadow, but shadow moved faster than spark. And the blinders. They had learned to speak without ever opening their mouths. Every city has a heartbeat. In Birmingham, it pulsed through the tram lines. They clattered and groaned along the cobbled roads, tracing the city's bones with steel and soot. And on one rare day, for the first time in years, that heartbeat faltered. It was the day the trams stopped. Not due to storm, nor fire, nor mechanical fault, but because of salt. Thomas Mallory would never forget it. It began innocently. A tram stalled at the edge of Corporation Street. A boy from the southern yard, barely older than Thomas, reported the brakes had locked. Passengers stepped off, grumbling, and made their way through the mist on foot. An hour later, a second tram failed, then a third. By mid-morning, the lines were silent. The clanging of bells, the creak of the rails, gone. At first, the city assumed a strike, but the blinders knew better, because they had heard the whispers. Salt in the gears. A sabotage. The trams were more than transport. They were lifelines. They carried runners, messages, goods hidden beneath floorboards and in the sleeves of uniforms. The blinders didn't own the system, but they knew how to move with it, silent, swift. Without it, their world slowed. And worse, vulnerability crept in. Thomas and Harry walked the lines that morning, following the rails eastward to the depot. Crowd of workers stood outside the gates, faces grim. Some muttered about ghosts in the machines, others about rival gangs or factory bosses. But Harry's eyes were fixed on the wheels of the parked trams. He knelt, scraped a finger along the undercarriage, and tasted the dust. Salt, he confirmed. Too coarse for winter stock. This was placed. Why? Thomas asked. To stop us, Harry replied. To send a message. Nell arrived an hour later with 2 cipher notes in her coat and a pistol hidden in the binding of a knitting book. She had already traced the sabotage to 3 key tram paths, all routes used by blinder runners. They knew where we moved, she said quietly. They knew which cars we used, which hours, and they salted all 3? Nell nodded. But not all at once. They waited. They watched. Thomas looked toward the depot, smoke rising faintly from the far stacks. It's the gallows men, he said. No, said a voice behind them. Auntie. She stepped through the crowd, eyes sharper, then steel. It's someone else, someone smarter. Gallows men would have set fire. This, she gestured to the rails. This is strategy. The blinders didn't panic, they never did, but they prepared. Thomas was sent with Wren to check the side tracks. Old. Routes long abandoned or rarely used. They found one near Hockley that still held enough life for a small run. Another in Sparkbrook, forgotten beneath grime and moss. The plan was simple. Reclaim the lines. But reclaiming meant risk. Someone had salted them, which meant someone would watch. That night, beneath a clouded moon, the blinders moved like ghosts. Not in caps, not in coats. Those would draw eyes. They dressed as labourers, mechanics, ticket takers. Thomas wore an apron and grease across his face. He carried no notes. just a bundle of tools and a heavy silence. Harry led them to the Sparkbrook tram. It had sat idle for months, its bell rusted, its cabin home to birds. "This one moves," he said. "We're not just riding it," Nell added. "We're baiting it." Thomas understood. They would light it up, roll it along the old path, and wait to see who tried to stop it. They started the engine by hand, coaxing breath from the old machine like waking a sleeping lion. The wheels shrieked, then turned. The tram rolled forward slowly, steadily. Thomas stood at the rear platform, watching the fog curl in its wake. Then, near the fifth turn, they heard it. A footstep too fast, a cough not meant to be heard. Harry raised his hand. The tram slowed. 2 figures emerged from the shadows, boys with caps too clean and shoes too sharp. Not gallows men, not local outsiders. One held a glass bottle, the other a bag. Salt. Thomas felt his heart rise into his throat. Harry didn't speak. He leapt. So did Nell. The struggle was short. Blinders didn't fight like drunks. They struck like thunder. Silent, sudden, over before breath could rise. The bottle shattered, the salt scattered, but the message had been sent. Someone new was moving in Birmingham. They tied the boys and dragged them to the depot. Auntie arrived, arms crossed. No apron this time, just fury. "Where are you from?" she asked. No answer. Harry drew a mark on the wall, a blade over an anvil. "Do you know what that is?" The taller boy flinched. Nell whispered, "London." A pause. Then the shorter boy muttered, "Camberwell." The word struck like lightning. Camberwell, a southern syndicate, not known for their brutality, known for their patience, for their strategies, for salt. The blinders didn't kill them. They sent them back. With bandaged hands and a warning stitched into their sleeves, an old miner's curse in ink. This city bites back. The trams ran again by dawn, slowly at first, then faster. By midday, they clattered through the streets as if nothing had happened. But the blinders knew. Everything had changed. In the weeks that followed, Thomas walked the lines differently. He no longer watched just for gallows men or constables. Now, he looked for the patient ones, the planners, the ones who salted before they struck. And he remembered the lesson. Not all attacks are loud. Some come with steam and silence. In the world of the blinders, it was said that silence was sharper than any blade, and shadows moved faster than justice. But there was one thing deadlier still, something they could not dodge, trick, or hide from. Time. Time, for all its softness, was relentless. It did not chase like a constable or strike like a rival. It whispered, waited, wore down the sharpest minds and the bravest hearts. And no one understood the value or the danger of time better than the clockmaker. His shop was tucked into a narrow lane off Winson Street, behind a chemist's that always smelled faintly of vinegar and coal tar. The sign above his door read, "Horology and Repair," though few ever wandered inside. The front window was dusted in soot, and the clocks inside, tall ones, squat ones, clocks with glass faces and brass gears, ticked out of sync, each following its own rhythm. Thomas first entered the shop on a quiet Tuesday, sent by Nell. "Don't ask for anything," she'd said. "Just watch the time." Inside, it was dim, the air thick with oil and dust. Dozens of clocks lined the shelves, ticking in slow chorus. Behind the counter stood a man in a grey waistcoat, his hair the colour of smoke. He did not look up when Thomas entered. His hands moved like water over the gears of a disassembled carriage. Clock. Thomas waited. Exactly 4 minutes and 44 seconds later, the man said, "You're early. I wasn't given a time," Thomas replied. That was the test. The clockmaker's name was Mr. Perrin. No first name, no title, just Perrin. He wasn't a blinder, not officially, but he was trusted. He had once fixed a broken watch for Harry. Without payment, and without questions. And when that same watch was later found in the pocket of a dead constable, cleaned and rewound, the message had been clear. Perrin understood things. He understood silence. He understood timing. And more than anything, he understood how to use time not just to measure, but to control. For months, Thomas visited the shop in secret. Not every day, never on a schedule, but often enough to learn. Perrin spoke very little, but when he did, it was like striking a match in a dark room. Most boys think time is a straight thing, he told Thomas once. Like a tram rail, you ride it forward and hope you don't fall off. He placed a pocket watch on the counter, opened the back, and pointed to the gear train. But time isn't straight, it's gear work. Every moment turns another. Every delay creates a new alignment. Thomas leaned closer. So every choice changes the next? Perrin nodded. And if you know how the gears turn, you can make the world tick to your rhythm. Soon, Thomas began helping with the repairs. Not because he was asked, but because he wanted to understand. He learned how to reset the balance wheel, how to polish a mainspring until it gleamed, how to feel the tremble of a mechanism that was moments from failing. He learned that the difference between a smooth-ticking watch and a jammed one could be a single grain of soot, and he learned how Perrin used clocks not just to measure time, but to send messages through it. One day, Perrin handed him a pocket watch. Heavy, elegant, the back was etched with a lion. "Take this to the baker's on Garrison," he said. Thomas nodded. "What do I say?" "Nothing," Perrin replied. "The watch is already speaking." At the bakery, Thomas placed the watch on the counter and walked away. An hour later, a fire broke out on the South Docks. Coincidence? No. The fire was a distraction. The watch had contained not just time, but a delay fuse, a mechanism of Perrin's own design, hidden in the body of an antique. That was the day Thomas understood. Time was not just something to endure, it was something to wield. The Blinders began, using Perrin's creations more and more. Timed notes, delivered to specific locations that only revealed their messages at certain hours. Mechanical locks that would not open until a set gear turned past midnight. Even decoy clocks placed in rival territories, ticking just out of sync, as a mark. They called it ghost work. Thomas called it poetry, because each piece was crafted not with violence, but with precision. No blood, no alarm, just time and silence. But like all sharp things, time could cut both ways. One evening, Perrin failed to open. His shop, the door was locked. The clocks inside stilled. Thomas knocked, waited, then noticed the tall grandfather clock in the window. Its hands pointed not to midnight or noon, but to 8 and 5. 5. He ran. At the 8th hour and 5th minute past the bells, he found the message, hidden in a clock tower near the New Hall tolls. Inside the hatch, a journal, Perrin's writing, a map of signals, a note. "I've gone ahead. My gear has turned. Protect the balance." Perrin had vanished, no signs of struggle, only silence. They never found him. Some said he'd been taken by rival engineers from the Camberwell syndicate. Others believed he had simply timed his own exit, choosing a final moment the way others choose a coat or a farewell. But Thomas never forgot him. He kept one of Perrin's unfinished watches in his pocket for years, a reminder that even silence has rhythm, even absence has timing, and when the city seemed loud or lost or moving too fast, Thomas would wind that little watch and listen to the quiet, to the gears, to the time. The alleys and back lanes of Birmingham, so often soaked in soot and smudged with the breath of labourers, hid not just the desperate or the dangerous, they also hid the powerful, not those with titles etched in marble, perhaps, but those whose power was sealed behind closed doors, stitched in fine suits, and sharpened with gold. The Blinders had always known that wealth moved quietly, But Thomas Mallory would soon discover a world where coin was not merely carried, it commanded. They called them the Gilded. Not lords in the legal sense, but aristocrats. Of a different breed, factory owners, arms dealers, merchants of influence who wore gloves in summer and never lifted their own pens. Their boots never touched ash, yet they controlled the price of bread, the fate of rail workers, and which trams stopped running. It was said they never looked down, because they never thought anyone existed below. It began with a shipment. A crate, unmarked, arrived at the old tram depot near Bordersley. Wren intercepted the ledger, tucked inside a receipt for tea and spare tram wheels, and brought it to Nell. The items listed were unusual: velvet gloves, stained glass, 3 revolvers, and lace. Real lace. Not the kind bought in markets, but the kind sold by the inch in drawing rooms where gas lamps flickered beside marble. Who needs lace and guns in the same box? Nell asked. Thomas had no answer, but he remembered what Auntie once said. The richest man is the one who can afford contradiction. The investigation unfolded like the layers of an opera. Each name on the shipping record led not to a man, but to a business. Each business, when traced, belonged to a trust. And each trust, when pried open like a rusted lock, revealed a single signature. C. Moorgrave. A name that meant nothing to the streets, but meant everything to the moneyed. Harry recognized it. He doesn't own factories, he said. He owns the owners. Thomas stared at the name. Why lace? He asked again. To remind us, Nell answered, that even beauty can be cruel. The Blinders never feared common enemies. Rival gangs could be outmaneuvered. Coppers could be bribed or dodged. But the Gilded? They didn't play the same game. They owned the board. And now it seemed they were watching. Because the next crate didn't contain revolvers or velvet. It contained a note, folded once, tied with ribbon, and addressed to T. Mallory. Thomas opened it beneath the low light of the back room in the King's Chance. Inside, a card, heavy, cream-coloured, embossed with gold. Your silence has weight. Let us lighten it. On the back, a location. No date, no signature, just a time. 10 o'clock, sharp. He should have burned it. He should have told Harry. But something in him, something cold and curious, pulled him toward that gold-etched door. The address led to a townhouse in Edgbaston, its windows shuttered, its hedges trimmed by hand. The door opened before he could knock. A man in a waistcoat gestured. No words. Inside, the house was silent. No servants, no clutter, just stillness. And in the parlour, a man, white-haired, not old, elegant, not flashy. He sat by the fire, swirling a glass of brandy. You're young, he said. Thomas didn't speak. Good, the man replied. Only the young still believe in weight. His name was not offered, but it didn't matter. He was one of them, the Gilded. And he spoke with the ease of someone who had never been interrupted. I've watched your blinders, he said. Admired their symmetry, their restraint. He paused. But restraint only matters when there's something more dangerous beneath it. Thomas narrowed his eyes. What do you want? The man smiled. I want what all men with power want. Continuity. He gestured to a velvet pouch on the table. Thomas didn't. Move, you won't open it now, the man said. You'll wait, because you understand the most valuable currency is patience. He rose. This is not a threat, Mr. Mallory. It's an invitation. Thomas turned to leave. And Thomas, the man added, we know who lit the third candle. For Reggie. The name hit like a blade wrapped in silk. Back at the King's Chance, Thomas opened the pouch. Inside, a coin. Not just any coin, a sovereign. Minted in gold. But it had no face, no queen, no king, only a mirror-polished surface reflecting him. He didn't tell anyone about the meeting. Not yet, because he didn't know what it meant. But he carried the coin in his coat, near his ribs. a reminder that power didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered through velvet. Nell noticed the change in him. "You're quieter," she said. "I met silence louder than mine," he replied. She didn't press, because she too had seen the glint of knives dressed as candlesticks. The blinders remained in the fog, still fast, still sharp. But Thomas began watching new corners, not for knives, but for smiles that didn't reach the eyes, for questions asked without words, and for lace, draped not as luxury, but as warning. The gilded were no longer behind the curtain. They were leaning forward. And Thomas knew. Sometimes the deadliest blade came not from the street, but from a hand wrapped in silk. There were ledgers for every part of the blinder life. Some held routes and deliveries, others names and numbers scrawled in shorthand. But there was one that no one spoke of aloud, no one admitted existed. And yet everyone in the circle knew it by name, the Black Ledger. It wasn't kept in the King's Chance. It wasn't buried beneath floorboards or hidden in a clock's hollow. It lived only in motion, carried, never stored. It contained no receipts, no coin counts, no business dues. It held secrets, the kind that reshaped fates, the kind worth dying for. Thomas Mallory first heard of it on a bitter morning, the sky smeared with ash and the air too still for comfort. He had delivered a routine message to a contact near the edge of Sparkhill. The man, one of Nell's informants, was older, nearly blind, with fingers that trembled when he passed the paper. "Tell them the ink is bleeding," the man muttered, before turning and vanishing into the alley's mist. Thomas brought the phrase to Harry, unsure if it meant anything at all. But Harry's face changed. He didn't speak. He just reached for his coat. In the cellar beneath an old printmaker's shop, the circle gathered. Nell, Harry, Auntie, Mason, even Finn, who had not spoken since Reggie's disappearance, was there, his face pale, his coat stiff with dust. A single candle lit the space. Auntie spoke first. "It's been breached." "No," one asked what. They knew. Nell laid out a map of the city. 3 symbols had been marked in fresh ink. A wheel, a feather, a knife. "The Black Ledger has passed through all 3, she said, but one of the couriers didn't finish his route. "Dead?" Mason asked. "No body," Nell replied, "but his trail stops in Smethwick." Harry exhaled slowly. They're reading it. The ledger was unlike any book Thomas had ever seen. When it finally came into view, passed into the room by a trembling boy with coal on his hands, it looked ordinary. Leather cover, no lock, worn edges. But inside, its pages were coded, not in cipher, but in memories. Each entry was a story, disguised as fiction. Names were changed, but only slightly. Places became metaphors. And within the lines, the blinders had hidden their truths. Who owed what? Who had been spared? Who had betrayed, and worse? Who didn't know they were marked? Thomas read a single page and then closed it. It told of a fire. Not the fire he knew, the one that distracted the coppers in Ladywood, but another, a fire in Coventry. One that had been started not by rivals, but by a desperate boy ordered to prove himself. A boy who had lied about who gave the order. Thomas looked at Nell. She said nothing. The Black Ledger wasn't just a record, it was a confession. Map of all the shadows the blinders had stepped into and out of, and now someone else had touched it. Not the gallows men, not Camberwell, the gilded. Auntie's voice was colder than Thomas had ever heard. If they read it, we lose more than names. "They'll turn our own against us," Harry said. "Leverage, lies, truth used as poison." Nell placed a hand on the ledger's cover. "We burn it." "No," Thomas said. All eyes turned to him. "There's something else we can do." It wasn't courage that made him speak. It was clarity. A quiet thought, sharp as the razors once sewn into caps. "We rewrite it," Thomas said. turn it into fiction. Mason frowned. It already is fiction. Then we bury the truth deeper, Thomas continued. Plant false stories. Send it back into their hands. Let them choke on their own certainty. Nell's eyes brightened, a flicker of dangerous admiration. Turn the ledger into a blade, she whispered. They worked for 5 nights, in the back room of the printmaker's shop. Thomas wrote, Nell edited. Harry chose which truths to twist and which to sharpen. Auntie oversaw it all, silent but present, her shadow long against the candlelit walls. They wove a new narrative of betrayals that never happened, debts that never existed, alliances forged only in ink. And then they placed the black ledger into a courier bag, stitched with red thread. The boy who carried it was not told what he held, only that it must reach Camberwell's edge. They let it fall into enemy hands and waited. 2 weeks later, the Gilded made a move. Subtle, quiet, but telling. A blinder safe house in Edgbaston was approached with a promise. Protection in exchange for silence. But the name they used was wrong. A name that had only existed in the rewritten ledger. And the safe house had already been evacuated. The trap collapsed inward. The message was clear. The Gilded had read the lies and believed them. Thomas stood on the roof of the King's Chance that night, watching the lights flicker across the city. Nell joined him. You rewrote history, she said. No, Thomas replied. I rewrote a warning. He held up a scrap from the ledger's original page, the only piece they kept. It read, What is true today may kill tomorrow. Nell smiled faintly. You're not the boy who carried coal anymore. I know. The black ledger had been weaponized, but it was also buried now. In story. In silence. In Thomas. There are nights when even the gas lamps hold their breath. Nights when the fog rolls in so thick it muffles not just footsteps, but thoughts. Curtains of grey that wrap around chimneys and whisper against window panes. It was on such a night that Thomas Mallory reached the edge of something vast. Not a cliff, not a battlefield, but something far quieter. A choice. He had known choices before, whether to run or to stay, whether to speak or to listen, whether to trust or simply observe. But this was different. It wasn't a decision that shaped a moment. It was one that could shape the city itself. It began with a folded slip of card, cream-coloured, slipped beneath the door of the King's Chance just after dusk. There was no knock, no messenger in sight, only the card. A single sentence printed in embossed letters. The gates open at midnight. No name, no seal, only a location. An address in Edgbaston, and below it, in handwriting, Thomas recognised from the black ledger's false entries. For the boy with the coal-smudged hands. He brought it to Auntie first. She read it, then set it gently on the table, her fingers resting upon it as if it might slip away. They're not summoning you, she said softly. They're testing you. Testing what? Your distance from them. The Gilded had been watching. That much was clear. They had tested his loyalty once, with coin and subtle threat. Then again, through the misread ledgers. But this was something else. This was invitation, not to betray the Blinders, but to become something other. To leave behind smoke and soot for drawing rooms and silk chairs. To trade silence for strategy. Fog for gold. Thomas walked the streets alone that night, long before the hour. He passed the bakers that once gave him crusts for his mother. He lingered near the bridge where Reggie had taught him how to watch shadows instead of people. He stood outside the tram depot where the first coin had passed between his fingers and learned the weight of trust. Every stone whispered, every step remembered. He arrived at the address with minutes to spare. It was not a manor, not a mansion, just a townhouse. behind iron gates, too perfectly symmetrical to be accidental. The door opened before he knocked. A man in evening dress nodded, no words. He was led through a hall of mirrors, walls that reflected his cap, his boots, his eyes, but somehow never the boy he once was. In a room with velvet curtains and brandy untouched, Thomas found the same figure from before. The gilded man, white hair, dark smile, voice like velvet over frost. "You came," he said, as though they'd been mid-conversation and Thomas had only stepped out for air. Thomas said nothing. The man poured 2 glasses, one for himself, one left untouched. "The Blinders, they are clever," he continued, "disciplined, but you, Mr. Mallory, you are something else. You listen." Thomas remained still. "We build with stone," the man said, gesturing around him. "You build with silence. That, to me, is potent." "And what is it you want?" Thomas asked, at last, his voice low. The man stepped closer, his eyes calm and patient. "To offer you a place where silence becomes command, where you speak and the streets move, not like a whisper, but like wind." He set a small box on the table. Thomas opened it. Inside, a ring, plain gold, etched with a single word on the inside of the band. "Balance." He left without the ring. The man did not follow. He had not expected acceptance, only contemplation. By the time Thomas returned to the King's Chance, it was nearly dawn. The fire had been lit. Nell sat reading a half-burnt newspaper. Harry leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Auntie poured tea. They didn't speak. They waited, and Thomas, without a word, pulled the card from his coat and placed it on the table. Then he did something else. He removed his cap, the same one given to him in the alley behind the railway yard years ago. He turned it slowly in his hands, and then, gently, he set it down. Not as rejection, not as farewell, but as grounding, a reminder of where he began and why he had stayed. Later that morning, he returned to the tram lines, not to run messages, not to scout corners, but to walk. He passed children with patched boots, men coughing black from their lungs, women hanging laundry in silence, and every one of them, their very presence, answered the question the Gilded had posed. Who do you serve, the ones who built palaces, or the ones who carried the bricks? At dusk, Thomas gathered the young ones, the new runners, the boys with questions in their eyes. He sat with them, as Reggie once had with him. He didn't talk of strategy. He told them stories, not about violence, but about silence, about choice, about the strength in knowing when to speak and when to walk away. The Gilded never contacted him again, not directly. But sometimes, Thomas would pass a man in a carriage, and their eyes would meet. And the man would nod once, a nod that did not mean victory, only recognition. Thomas had chosen the fog, not because it was easier, but because it was honest. And in that choice, he stepped fully into the man he had become. Not a boy in a borrowed cap, not a messenger on the run, but a keeper of something older than gold. The keeper of the streets. The voice of the quiet. The weight of memory. The city of Birmingham never slept, not truly. Its breath rose in the steam from chimneys. Its heart beat in the roll of tram wheels, and its voice lived in the silence between footsteps. And in that living city, where soot settled on windows, like morning frost, Thomas Mallory came to understand the shape of endings, not as sharp breaks, but as circles drawn gently, so the beginning could follow the end without a seam. By the time the spring of 1892 rolled into the streets like a soft tide, Thomas was no longer the boy who watched from alley corners. His name, once spoken only by those in the know, now passed in careful tones between shopkeepers, tram guards, and chimney sweeps alike, not in fear, but in respect. He wore the same cap he had always worn, creased at the brim, the blade long removed. He hadn't needed it for some time, because his strength now came from presence, and his legacy was not in what he had taken, but in what he had preserved. That year, the Blinders were stronger than ever, not just in number, in vision. Auntie still ran the king's chance, though her pace had slowed, and her eyes now carried the heaviness of 100 choices made in quiet. Nell had expanded the code network to reach Manchester and Liverpool. Her cipher books were now copied by hand and protected like relics. Runners in Bristol spoke her name with awe. Harry no longer ran the streets. He had become something else, a mentor, a steady light in the fog. And Thomas, well, Thomas sat at the centre of it all, not on a throne, but at the corner table, cup of black tea in hand, listening, always listening. Then came the night he received the second letter, not from the gilded, not from rivals, from home. The home he hadn't visited in years. The house where his mother once sang lullabies between coughs and knitted wool into shapes that made no sense. She was gone, slipped quietly into the night, as gentle souls so often do. No ceremony, no coins for the doctor, just a note from the neighbour, who'd once baked bread for them on Sundays. Thomas read it alone on the rooftop of the King's Chance, as dawn broke pale over chimney stacks. He didn't cry. Not then. Not when he returned to the house. Not when he folded the worn shawl she left behind and tucked it into his coat. But when he found the cap, his first, the one given to him by Harry, still hidden under the hearthstone, he sat on the floor and the tears came like rain on a quiet roof. Loss, he had learned, does not steal. It plants something instead, a weight, a memory, a shape that never leaves, but it also gives clarity, softness, resolve. It was then that Thomas made his final choice. He called a meeting, not in secret, not with coded notes, just a quiet announcement passed from mouth to mouth. And when the Blinders gathered, young and old, scribes and scouts, runners and readers, he stood without pretense. "This story isn't mine anymore," he said, voice even. "It belongs to all of you." He set the cap down, not cast aside, not broken, but placed, gently, in the centre of the room, as if to say, "Here is where it began. Here is where it belongs." They did not protest, because they knew. They had watched him grow into more than a leader. He had become a keeper of time, of silence, of balance. And now he was passing the torch, not in fire, but in trust. In the seasons that followed, Thomas faded from the edges of the city's attention. His name was still spoken, but softer, like something precious wrapped in linen. He travelled, briefly, to Oxford, to the coast, even to Dublin once, where he watched fog roll over a different kind of city. But always, Birmingham called him home. And always, he answered. Not as king, not as captain, just as Thomas, the boy with coal on his hands, the man who had chosen the fog. Years later, a young blinder, barely 16, all knobby elbows and nervous eyes, would find a cap in the drawer of a back room in the King's Chance. Inside the lining, stitched with old thread, were 4 small symbols, a button, a flame, a feather, and a knot. He asked Nell, now grey at the temples, what they meant. She smiled gently. Stories, she said, all stories, and so the cap passed on, not with fanfare, but with purpose. And the story of Thomas Mallory, the boy who watched, the runner who remembered, the leader who stepped back so others might step forward, became something more than history. It became the foundation, because in the end, the Blinders were not about fear, not about blades. They were about balance, about knowing when to stand and when to sit, about choosing silence when noise would do, and choosing kindness when cruelty seemed easier. The city moved on, as all cities do, but in its breath, in its bricks and soot and slow dawn fog, his name remained, not carved, not shouted, just there, waiting for the next boy with coal on his hands to listen.